a girl from Northern Ontario, and growing up in Northern Ontario, I didn't see a whole lot of architecture. That really sparked my interest. It was kind of more when I started going around and looking at different schools and really getting a chance to figure out what I wanted to do that I picked architecture. I wasn't one of those kids that grew up knowing what they wanted to do. But I saw how it could help communities, and I really just wanted to bring that back to my own community.
My name is Patrick Harrop. I'm a licensed architect, but also I'm an associate professor of architecture at the McEwen School of Architecture. And I have served as Holly's thesis advisor throughout the duration of this project.
My shift idea stems from being from a small northern town and wanting to really give back to the community. And I didn't really know where to start, and Pat helped me with that, especially in the beginning when I was struggling with trying to figure out what this project was. Because I looked at all the projects I had done in school, they had really interesting programming, cafes, schools, student housing, things like that. And I wanted to do something like that for my community. But then I realized a lot of these projects wouldn't work in my community. And that really kind of started me on, why don't these projects work? So I kind of took a step back and looked at my hometown, Kirkland Lake, from an outsider's perspective. And Kirkland Lake's a small mining community. It's a single industry community, meaning that most of the population relies on mining in some way. And how that really changes what type of programming you're going to introduce into it is that the programming you introduce needs to be able to shift, needs to be flexible. Mining towns like mine go through economic shifts, boom bust cycles. So your population can change drastically. So I took a step back and I decided to really look at the community from an outsider's perspective. And what I realized was that the thing that made the community really unique was the mine. So I decided to research that a little bit more. And a really unique thing about the project was that, and a unique thing about Kirkland Lake is that the mine actually travels underneath Kirkland Lake itself. And how that impacts the community, how that impacts the environment is that you essentially have to de-water that area to be able for the mine to be productive. So Kirkland Lake does not actually have a lake because of this dewatering process. The lake itself was drained way back in the day. And so my project is looking at, okay, so what happens once the mine closes and this lake refills? So you're going to have many things happening at once at that point in time. Like I mentioned, those boom bust cycles. You're going to have the low economically, the population is going to shrink, but you're also going to have the return of this lake, which I found super interesting. So that became the focus of the project. And how I addressed this, the approach that I took was that I implemented kind of a phased design approach, which really looked at the life cycle of the community and what happened during this process. So all of the projects and all of the buildings that are part of this project all required very flexible design. They had to be very passive. They had to require very little maintenance, and they had to acknowledge that their use might change. So a building might start out as a storage for equipment for the ecological rehabilitation of the lake, but then it might change later on and be a rental facility for snowshoes or kayaks as the lake refills. So that's essentially what my shift project is.
Seeing industrialized landscapes, we all know about it. we all have, we're all seduced by the images of the industrial landscapes, but to actually come in contact with them is really quite fascinating and very surprising. And there are a lot of things that Holly just accepted as being completely normal, such as having these giant pits which are so deep they give off hot air, to have this idea that Main Street has a parallel underground street, which is a giant tunnel. So from my perspective as an outsider, there was something absolutely fascinating about it. There's a huge potential for us as architects to try to enlarge in the scope of what can be possible for a community, and to try to predict how architecture and architectural ideas could actually become catalysts for actually reversing a trend of degrowth right now. The common assumption is that these industrial towns are just going to die, and they're just people are just going to move out. And what I was really fascinated with was through Holly's proposal was how you can actually catalyze being a community member, but also catalyze through some building projects, small and subtle moves in building projects, and also landscape approaches, how you could actually not necessarily grow a city to what its former self was, but to at least make it a livable and active community. And that's what was really fascinated about Holly's approach. And again, Holly was, well, my city is dying, I don't know what to do. And one was to, of course, be realistic about it, but two was to try to see what was there and actually transform it somehow.
Well, I think this project is important to me personally because it is generally just a very personal project. Like Pat said previously, it's me essentially trying to save my hometown from some perceived threat I have for the future. So that's why it's important to me. And I think a lot of small towns, especially northern towns, I've worked with a lot of different towns right now as an intern architect, and they're facing very similar issues. Especially in northern Ontario, there's a big concern in they want to grow, they want to help their community, but they don't really know how. And so I find a lot of these communities end up trying to do what trying to use techniques from other communities that aren't necessarily going to work because of the context. So you have communities up here that are very similar to Kirkland Lake, trying to use strategies that are used in Southern Ontario in communities that are much more stable economically because they have more diversity. And because we don't have that diversity up here, and in generally some smaller communities where you're relying on one single industry, you have to take a step back and really look at, is what we're proposing right for the community? Just because it works for another community does not mean it will work for yours. And I think if that that position and that way of looking at things was used throughout a lot of these communities, they have projects that might be able to help them a bit more. And that's kind of what I like this project to influence really.
These communities are born of these industries, and it's not just in Northern Ontario, it's actually all across North America. You know, it's in cities like Sault Ste. Marie, but even in urban cores like Montreal, which had an industrial sector which has shifted to another part of the world. So it's a very big problem, because what we're continuously faced with is a deindustrialization at a massive scale that is happening all across North America. And yet any kind of tangible solution that we try to find is usually trying to match the monolithic scale of these industries with some kind of monolithic activity, such as a giant art gallery or some kind of festival or something like that. And I think Holly's approach is is really is much more modest, and it's being taken at the scale of the actual community, where the interventions are small, they're modest, and they're feasible, and that gives probably these communities the best possible chance of taking advantage of the infrastructure that's actually there, and this deindustrialization deindustrialization wave that is going across North America. I think it's actually it's a very important thing for us as architects to take the lead on, because um, so far the way that it's been handled is that these towns just die and they're left as ghost towns, which is all very interesting, but it does result in a huge waste. So I think there's a much larger discussion about economics and sustainability and how we develop things that is really part of this whole story.